Today I want to talk about honesty, truthfulness and transparency and the way it applies both to me as a person, you and I, and governments. The passages I've chose to look at are verses in Proverbs chapter 12 and they talk about this very topic from the wisdom of Solomon. Verse 17 of chapter 12, a truthful witness gives honest testimony, but a false witness tells lies. Truthful lips endure forever, but a lying tongue lasts only a moment. The Lord detests lying lips, but he delights in those who are truthful. So it's clear from God's word that he's interested in us telling the truth and being honest. And I think we ought to be thinking about that in terms of our government's response to COVID-19 and our own personal honesty with ourselves and others as this pandemic unfolds. Firstly, corporately. Obviously, we know that Western governments particularly are working flat out to resolve this crisis. I don't think anyone doubts the sheer energy and 24/7 commitment of governments to get this thing done as best they can. We're all groping in the dark a bit, but I think we can say with some certainty there's no lack of willingness. But I do think, not just here in the UK, but around the world, there's been an absence of transparency in the communication of governments, not least in the area of the scientific evidence. Recently here in the United Kingdom, Sir David King, who was the chief scientific advisor before Sir Patrick Vallance here in the UK, said that he wasn't at all confident that the scientific advice was being given in a transparent and open way. Indeed, he's so concerned about the advice the government are getting, he set up a kind of alternative group of scientists. Now, it's a pretty serious thing. I've been trying to do my own fact-checking on some of the things that are said and the certainties that there are apparently around this, which don't appear to me to be very certain at all. I've commented before about the fact that there isn't really the science, doesn't exist. There are a range of scientific views. Take the number that our Prime Minister quoted recently of a possible 500,000 deaths, usually drawing on material from a Professor Neil Ferguson and from Imperial College. Something struck me as being odd about that number, and I looked back in the figures from the past about previous worrisome infections and what was said. And I discovered this to my surprise. Neil Ferguson said in 2005, when bird flu struck, that up to 200 million people worldwide might die. In the end, 282 people died. I think you can see that is a shocking difference. Now, scientific guesses about the future are based on something called modelling, but they're only as good as the information that you put in. Sometimes I think that modelling appears to be certain, but is actually more like an educated guess. Here's the same Imperial College 4 years later in 2009 asked to predict what was likely to happen with the swine flu epidemic. Based on their evidence, the British government said 65,000 UK deaths might be the reasonable worst case scenario. 65,000. In the end, 457 people died. Now, these are errors of estimation of a massive magnitude. So what would be really helpful, I think, if there was just a bit more humility about all of this, a bit more saying we're not sure or we don't know. We're grown-ups. We can take it if people will only be transparent with us. But before we point the finger at the government too much, we should point the finger at ourselves and our own often lack of truthfulness. So we have to ask ourselves during this lockdown, am I being honest with myself about what's going on? Am I letting myself go mentally and becoming sloppy in my habits? Am I becoming physically lazy and putting on far more weight than is good for me physically? Are my spiritual values gradually being eroded during this time and they're not being kept up to date with God, as it were? And am I being truthful about my current state? Am I really super anxious or worried? The recent surveys, one published yesterday morning, said that over half the British population surveyed said when lockdown was announced they had high levels of anxiety, 50%. So let's be honest with ourselves. If we're struggling, let's not just bring it to God in prayer, but let's talk to others. Let's ring a medical professional, the pastor of our church, a Christian friend, and talk these things through. So just as we long for honesty and transparency from our governments, let's exercise that honesty and transparency ourselves, being honest with ourselves about our current state, looking clear-eyed at our lives and making sure we tell the truth to God, who already knows, and to ourselves, so that our behaviour and lives can be the best they can be in line for what is true and right.